Have you ever considered what truly hides behind the mask on Halloween? We are taught to fear the ghouls and ghosts of fantasy, the monsters from our nightmares. But what if the most terrifying monster is not the one in a costume, but the one holding your hand, the one you trust completely? What if the hand that gives you candy is the same one that has signed your death warrant? This is a story about that very horror, a tale where the ultimate betrayal was wrapped in the innocent guise of a sweet treat, turning a night of joy into an eternal, chilling legend. Our story takes us back to a crisp autumn evening, October 31st, 1974, in the quiet, unassuming suburb of Pasadena, Texas. The air was filled with the scent of burning leaves and the excited shrieks of children. It was a perfect Halloween, a Rockwell painting come to life. Among the miniature witches and superheroes was 8-year-old Timothy O'Bryan, dressed as a colorful space ranger. He walked with his father, Ronald Clark O'Bryan, a man who, to the outside world, was just another suburban dad participating in the cherished annual tradition with his beloved son. Ronald, along with a neighbor and their collective children, moved from house to house. Timothy's plastic pumpkin filled slowly with chocolates and lollipops. But at one house, nestled in deep shadow at the end of a long driveway, something changed. The porch light was off, and no one answered the door for a long time. Ronald told the others to wait, that he saw a figure in the darkness. He went ahead alone, returning moments later, not with a handful of common candies, but with 5 giant 22-inch Pixy Stix, a rare and coveted prize for any child. Later that night, back in the warmth and safety of his home, Timothy begged his father to let him have just one piece of candy before bed. It was a classic childhood plea, one made in millions of homes that very night. His father, Ronald, acquiesced. He didn't just pick a random treat from the bucket, however. He specifically chose one of the giant Pixy Stix, the special candy he alone had procured from the dark, silent house. With his own hands, he helped his son open the powdered candy, a final, terrible act of fatherly care. Within an hour, the idyllic Halloween scene had shattered into a nightmare. Timothy began to vomit violently, convulsing in agony on the bathroom floor. His small body writhed in a pain no child should ever know. His father called for an ambulance, his voice strained with what sounded like panic. But it was too late. Little Timothy O'Bryan was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The sweet powder from the Pixy Stix, a symbol of childhood delight, had been laced with a fatal dose of potassium cyanide. The initial wave of terror that swept through Pasadena was palpable. The police immediately suspected a random act of sadistic violence, a maniac on the loose, poisoning Halloween candy. Panic spread like wildfire. Parents frantically called their neighbors. Police hotlines were overwhelmed with calls from terrified families, and officers went door to door, confiscating candy from children had trick-or-treated in the same neighborhood. The town held its breath, fearing who the next victim might be, believing a monster was stalking their children from the shadows. Detective Mike Miller, a man who had seen his share of darkness in his 20 years on the force, was assigned the case. He felt an immediate, unsettling coldness surrounding the O'Bryan home. It wasn't just the grief, which was strangely muted, but something else, something unnatural. He listened intently as Ronald O'Bryan recounted his story of the shadowy house and the unseen figure who had handed him the 5 poisoned straws of candy. O'Brien's story was detailed, perhaps too detailed, but he couldn't point out the exact house in the dark. The investigation became a frantic race against time. The other 4 Pixy Stix had been distributed by Ronald to other children, including his own daughter. Miraculously, none of the other children had eaten the candy yet. One girl had been unable to get the powder out because Ronald had stapled the top of the straw shut. This single act, perhaps a moment of hurried clumsiness, had saved her life. The police collected the remaining 4 straws, their brightly colored packaging now feeling like a grim mockery. Forensics confirmed their worst fears. All 5 of the giant Pixy Stix were packed with enough cyanide to kill several adults each. The poison had been carefully inserted, and the straws had been resealed with a staple. This wasn't a random contamination. This was a calculated, deliberate act of murder. The profile of the killer changed. They weren't looking for a deranged stranger, but someone methodical, someone who knew precisely what they were doing and how to deliver their fatal payload without being detected. Detective Miller couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with Ronald O'Brien's testimony. His grief seemed performative, his answers too rehearsed. He led the police on a walk through the neighborhood, but conveniently could not identify the house where he received the candy. Every door the police knocked on, every resident they interviewed, denied giving out giant Pixy Stix. The shadowy house, the source of the poison, seemed to have vanished into thin air, as if it had never existed at all. The pressure on the police department was immense. The media dubbed the unknown assailant the Candyman, a name that twisted a figure of childhood fantasy into a real-life boogeyman. Halloween, a day of innocent fun, was now tainted with a new and potent fear. Parents across the nation began inspecting their children's candy with a new level of paranoia. The crime had not just killed a child, it had murdered a piece of a cherished American tradition, poisoning the well of communal trust. The breakthrough in the case didn't come from a fingerprint or a witness. It came from a quiet, methodical check into Ronald O'Brien's life. Detectives discovered a man drowning in debt, owing over $100,000, an astronomical sum in 1974. He was on the verge of losing everything. His job as an optician unstable. His life, a facade of suburban success that was crumbling from within. He was a desperate man, and desperate men, as Detective Miller knew all too well, do desperate things. Then came the final, damning piece of the puzzle. Just months before that fateful Halloween night, Ronald Clark O'Bryan had taken out substantial life insurance policies on both of his children, Timothy and his younger sister. The policies were worth tens of thousands of dollars. The man who seemed to be the grieving father of a randomly targeted child was, in fact, poised to profit financially from his son's horrific death. The coldness Detective Miller had felt in the O'Bryan home suddenly had a name: greed. The investigation pivoted entirely. They were no longer hunting for a phantom trick-or-treater. The monster they were looking for had been in the house all along. Detectives learned that Ronald, an optician, had recently been asking colleagues at his work about the availability and lethal dosages of various poisons, specifically cyanide. He had claimed it was for research, a morbid curiosity. Now, that curiosity looked like cold, premeditated planning for the murder of his own flesh and blood. The police arrested Ronald Clark O'Bryan on November 5th, just 5 days after his son's funeral, a service at which he had appeared heartbroken. The community was stunned, then horrified. The man they had grieved with, the neighbor they had offered condolences to, was the very monster they had feared. The terror of a random killer was replaced by a far more intimate and disturbing horror. The evil that can fester within a seemingly normal family behind a closed door. The trial was a media sensation. The prosecution laid out its case with chilling precision. They argued that Ronald, crippled by debt, had hatched a diabolical plan. He would poison his own children for the insurance money, to make it look like the work of a random madman. He would also distribute the poisoned candy to other children in the neighborhood, sacrificing them as collateral damage to cover his tracks. His son, Timothy, was simply the primary target of his father's monstrous greed. O'Bryan's defense was weak. He stuck to his story of the shadowy figure and the unlit house, a tale that now seemed utterly unbelievable to the jury and the public. He maintained his innocence with a calm, almost unnerving demeanor throughout the trial. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no flicker of grief. He sat like a stone statue as witnesses, including his own wife, testified against him, painting a picture of a cold, calculating man obsessed with money. On June 3, 1975, after deliberating for less than an hour, the jury found Ronald Clark O'Bryan guilty of capital murder. During the penalty phase, it took them just over an hour to deliver their sentence. Death. The judge, in his final remarks, called the crime heinous and one of the most evil he had ever presided over. The man who had twisted a child's holiday into an instrument of death was now condemned to face his own. In the immediate aftermath, the O'Bryan family was destroyed. Ronald's wife, who had had initially supported him, divorced him, and later remarried, trying to build a new life for herself and her surviving daughter out of the ashes of her husband's unspeakable crime. The remaining children who had received the poisoned candy were left with the psychological trauma of knowing how close they had come to a gruesome death, all at the hands of their neighbor, their friend's father. The community of Pasadena was forever changed. The trust between neighbors was fractured. For years afterward, Halloween in that town was a muted, somber affair. Many parents forbade their children from trick-or-treating altogether. Hospitals began offering free X-ray screenings of Halloween candy. The story of the Candyman Killer became a cautionary tale, a dark stain on the holiday's history, a real-life horror story told to remind everyone that evil can wear the most ordinary of faces. Ronald O'Bryan spent nearly a decade on death row, appealing his conviction. He never admitted his guilt, never showed any remorse for killing his son. He continued to be known in prison as the Candyman, a nickname he reportedly hated. He was a pariah, even among other convicts. His crime considered uniquely monstrous. He was a father who had not only failed to protect his child, but had become the very monster in the dark he should have been protecting him from. On March 31, 1984, 10 years after he murdered his son, Ronald Clark O'Bryan was executed by lethal injection. His last meal was a simple steak and salad. As the execution commenced, a crowd gathered outside the prison walls. They weren't there to protest. They were there to celebrate. As the news of his death was announced, many in the crowd cheered. Some even threw candy at the prison walls, a final bitter act of poetic justice. But some stories don't end with the death of the monster. Some horrors leave an echo, a lingering chill that never quite fades. The house where the O'Bryans lived became a place of local legend. People who lived on that street would report strange occurrences, especially around Halloween. They spoke of a profound sadness that seemed to hang in the air, a permanent stain of grief that couldn't be washed away by time or new residents. Teenagers would dare each other to walk past the house late on Halloween night. Some claimed to see a small flickering light in the window of the room that used to be Timothy's bedroom. Others swore they could hear the faint, heartbreaking sound of a child crying softly in the dark, a cry that would be carried away on the autumn wind, a ghostly lament for a life stolen too soon by the one person who should have cherished it most. And what of Ronald O'Bryan, the Candyman himself? His execution may have ended his life, but it cemented his legacy as a true American horror story. He became more than a man. He became a symbol of a particular kind of evil, an evil that doesn't announce itself with claws and fangs, but with a smile and a piece of candy, an evil that proves the most terrifying monsters are the ones we invite into our homes. The legacy of his crime is still felt today. Every year, when parents warn their children not to take candy from strangers, or when they painstakingly inspect every piece of their child's Halloween haul. They are unknowingly participating in a ritual of fear that Ronald O'Bryan helped create. He poisoned more than just 5 Pixy Stix. He poisoned the very idea of trust and innocence associated with Halloween. Some paranormal investigators who have looked into the case have a darker theory. They suggest that Ronald wasn't just driven by debt. They whisper that on that Halloween night, when he approached that dark, empty house, he wasn't alone. They believe he made a pact, a deal with something far older and more malevolent than simple human greed, a sacrifice of his own blood in exchange for a way out of his worldly problems. According to this legend, the entity he dealt with now haunts the suburban streets of Pasadena. They say on Halloween, if you walk alone down a particularly dark street, you might feel a sudden drop in temperature. You might see a tall, indistinct figure standing in the shadows, holding something long and thin in his hand. They call it the Candyman's shadow, the echo of an evil that was invited in and never truly left. Is it just a ghost story, a legend born from a real-life tragedy? Perhaps, but the horror of Ronald O'Bryan's crime lies not in the supernatural, but in the profoundly, terrifyingly human. It's the story of a man who looked at his own son, a child full of love and trust, and saw nothing but a dollar sign. A man who was willing to extinguish that bright, innocent life for something as cold and meaningless as money. The real haunting is not the ghost of a crying child, but the chilling memory of what a father did. It is a reminder that the masks we wear on Halloween can conceal more than just our faces. They can conceal the absence of a soul. And so, the next time you see a child's trusting hand reach out for a sweet treat on that dark and hallowed night, remember Timothy O'Bryan. Remember that true evil rarely looks like a monster. Sometimes it looks just like Dad. This enduring legacy serves as a stark warning, a dark footnote in the annals of criminal history that resurfaces each October. The fear isn't just about poisoned candy anymore. It is about the violation of the most sacred trust imaginable. The story of the Candyman has become a modern folktale, a grim lesson passed down through generations, ensuring that the horror of that one Halloween night in 1974 is never truly forgotten, echoing in the careful hesitation of parents everywhere.